Welcome to episode 41 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Starting with today's episode, we'll jump right into the discussion and will refer everyone who's not familiar with our podcast to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about those, be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's episode, we'll cover roughly lines 258 through 357 from the Latin text, and we'll discuss topics that include how the nature of the mind and spirit is complex, that sense is not a property of the elements that make up the mind and the spirit, but rather an event of their combinations and motions. Now let's join the discussion with Martin and Charles reading today's text.
Yet we are not to suppose this nature of the mind to be simple and unmixed. For a thin breath mingled with a warm vapor forsakes the bodies of dying men, and this vapor draws the air along with it. For there can be no heat without air intermixed, and heat being in its nature rare, must needs have some seeds of air united with it. We find then the mind consists of 3 principles, of vapor, air, and heat. Yet all these are not sufficient to produce sense, for we cannot conceive that either of these, or all of them united, can be the cause of sensible motions that may produce reason and thought, and therefore a 4th nature must needs be added to these. And this indeed has no name at all, but nothing can be more apt to move, nothing more subtle than this, nor consist more of small smooth seeds. And this is what first raises a sensible motion through the body. This, as it is formed of the minutest particles, is first put into motion, then the heat and the unseen vapor receive a motion from it. And then we are, and so all the limbs are set a-going. Then is the blood agitated, and all the bowels become sensible. And last of all, pleasure or pain is communicated to the bones and marrow. But no pain or any violent evil can pierce so far without disordering and setting the whole into confusion, so that there is no more place for life, and the parts of the soul fly away through the pores of the body. But this motion often stops upon the surface of the body, and then the soul remains whole, and the life is preserved. Now, how these 4 principles are mixed, and in what manner they subsist, I am very desirous to explain, but the poorness of the Latin tongue prevents me, against my will. Yet, as far as that permits, I will endeavor briefly to touch upon this subject. The seeds, then, of these principles move so confusedly among themselves that no one of them can be separated from another, nor is there any place severally allotted to each where any one can act by itself. But there are, as it were, many powers of the same body. As in a piece of any animal there is smell, and heat, and taste, and out of all these one perfect body is composed, so heat, air, and the invisible vapor, and that 4th active quality, which is the principle of motion to the other 3, and from which all sensible motion rises through the limbs, compose by their mixture one subtle substance or one nature. This 4th something is deeply fixed in the inmost recesses of the body, nor is there anything in the whole body more secretly and inwardly placed. It is, as it were, the very soul of the soul itself. For as in the limbs and through all the body, the united force and power of the mind and soul are hid and unseen, because they are formed of small and few seeds. So this is something without a name, being composed of minute principles, lies deep and concealed. It is the very soul of the whole soul itself, and governs the whole body.
By the same rule, it is necessary that the vapor, the air, and the heat be so properly mingled through the limbs, and be disposed either higher or lower than one another, that one certain nature may be formed from all, lest the power of the heat, the vapor, and the air, being divided and separately placed, might destroy the sense and prevent its operation. Heat prevails in the mind when the creature is enraged, grows hot, and fire sparkles from its glowing eyes. Much vapor is cold, and the companion of fear. It excites horror in the body and shakes the limbs. But air is of a calm and mild quality. It resides in a quiet breast and a serene countenance. But those have most heat whose hearts are fierce, and whose angry mind are soon inflamed into passion. Of this sort, in the first place, is a distracted fury of lions, who, roaring, often burst their very breast, and are unable to contain the torrent of rage that swells within. The cold temperature of the deer has more of vapor, and sooner incites a chillness in the limbs, which causes a trembling motion through the whole body. But the nature of the ox consists more of soft air, nor does the smoky firebrand of anger, that spreads a shade of black darkness over the mind, too much inflame him. Nor is he stupefied by the darts of chilling fear, but his nature is placed between both, between the fierce lion and the deer. The mind of man is formed of the same principles. Though the discipline of philosophy may polish and correct some, yet it leaves behind the marks of the original nature of the mind. Nor are we to think that the seeds of vice can be wholly rooted out. One man, we see, runs more rashly into passion, another is more disposed to fear, and a third is apt to be more merciful than just. It is impossible, but the various tempers of mankind, and actions that follow them, must differ in many other instances, the reasons of which are at present out of my power to explain. Nor can I find words to express that variety of figures by which the seeds are distinguished, and from which this variety of disposition is produced. This, however, may justly be asserted on this occasion, that the traces of original nature which cannot be corrected by the rules of reason are so very small that nothing hinders us from leading a life worthy of the gods. This nature, therefore, of the soul is contained by the whole body. It is the keeper of the body and the cause of its safety, for they are both united closely together by mutual bonds, nor can they be torn asunder but by the destruction of both. As it is impossible to separate the odor from a lump of frankincense, but the nature of both must perish, so it is equally difficult to part the mind and soul from the whole body, but they must all be dissolved. Of such interwoven principles are they formed, from their very beginning, that they enjoy a common life, nor have either of them, either the mind or the body in a separate state, the power of sense without the assistance of each other. But sense is incited in us by the nerves, from the common motions of both, and by their joint operations. Besides, the body is never born alone, nor does it grow or continue after the soul is fled, for the water throws off a vapor when it is made hot, yet it is not by that means destroyed, but remains entire. The limbs, I say, cannot with the same safety bear the separation of the soul when it retires from them, but thus divided, they must all perish and rot together. For the mutual conjunction of the soul and the body from the very beginning, even as they lie in the womb of the mother, does so jointly promote the vital motions that no separation can be made without death and dissolution. From hence you learn that, since their preservation so much depends upon each other, their natures are also inseparably joined and united together. But further, if anyone denies that the body has sense, and believes that the soul diffused through the whole body is only capable of that motion we call sense, he opposes the plainest evidence and the truth of all experience. For who would ever pretend to say that the body has sense, if the thing itself did not fully prove and convince us of it? But it is plain, you'll say, that the body is void of all sense when the soul is gone. True, for this faculty is not peculiar to the body alone, but to the soul and body united, and we know the sense becomes weaker and decays as the body and soul grow old together.
Thank you, Charles. Let's go back to the very beginning and start to sort some of this out.
My throat's a little dry after that.
Okay. Elaine, are you still there?
Yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot going on in your mind. We're going to have to...
Oh, man.
Yes.
Those sections where Elaine says that there are parts where he goes beyond looking at evidence and uses a lot of conjecture. This is definitely where I see
it. Yes, I'm sure that observation applies here too. It's kind of like though when he goes and starts talking about the lions and deers and things like that, he's making a point that is important, which is true, that these animals have natures that come from somewhere. He's not doing a very good job, I think, in attributing them to different types of vapor or air and things like that. But on the other hand, he's giving something as a suggestion for what it could be related to. Mm-hmm. And when you compare it back to what we've been talking about that Plato was saying about recollection and past lives and so forth, he at least is providing some kind of a scientific explanation for how different animals can have different dispositions without a divine leadership. Let's stay with the first paragraph first.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this calls to mind the humors, the black bile and the
phlegm.
What were all the phlegm and blood,
Sanguine.
sanguine, and the yellow bile, and the personality characteristics that were supposed to be attributed to them. And there, you find variations of this in all sort of different cultures. And I'm thinking about, I don't know as much about this one, but I think about the, what's that, Ayurvedic medicine that has the vata and the pitta, if I may not be saying those things right, and the different kinds of people's personalities that you're supposed to be able to infer from their physical builds. He's doing the same kind of thing, not really a lot different from all of those things. Rest on physical properties, the material properties of the body, information, I guess, about the kind of person. But I object to calling this science, and this probably gets back to, you could have this as a hypothesis, but it's not science to say that these things are how it is. That's not scientific whatsoever. So as Charles said, he's gone way, way far. It's real interesting.
Ironically enough, the first sentence reminds me a lot of the 21 grams experiment.
Yeah.
Yes. I'd like to break up a couple of points that are in what we have as our first paragraph from this, yet we are not supposed to the line that says, but the motion stops at the surface of the body and the soul remains whole and life is preserved. What this section has called to my mind is a discussion we've had over the last several episodes about, he's not saying that there are mind and soul particles. But he's certainly saying that particles of a particular type make up the mind. But I think when he's talking about heat and air and vapor, and then he's talking about this translation says a fourth nature. It seems to me that whether it's significant to what we're talking about right now or not, that he's saying that these things are made up of small particles. But that doesn't mean that there's not transition phases where these particles are coming together and then forming something else. And I don't know if that's really been relevant to what we're talking about today. But when he talks about a fourth nature, he's certainly not saying that that's a particle. It's something that is presumably a combination of matter and void, just like everything else is. Mm-hmm.
And that
he doesn't make it clear whether this small smooth seeds that are this fourth thing, if he's only imagining that it's one type of small smooth seed or another, like a combination of different small smooth seeds. Yeah, I would almost lean towards him in saying that it's one, because otherwise he would. I think that by him saying there is a fourth nature, you got because he would imagine heat to be seeds and vapor and air to be seeds. Then this fourth, whatever it is that he's thinking of, would be a specific one type of seed.
He doesn't term it, but he does outright say that is what causes sensation. And from that, combined with the other three natures, forms a whole or the combination. He says that the fourth nature puts the others into motion.
Right.
Yeah, this discussion of three regular natures plus then some fourth unnamed nature, I think gets a lot of attention for the potential that in talking about a fourth nature, he is straying into supernatural or straying into some other area that would contradict his earlier premises. But of course, I don't think. Yeah, I think because he talks about it being.
That he's talking about particles.
Because he's talking about it being unnamed. He's talking about it as being mysterious. That's something that we're not familiar with, like we're familiar with vapor, air, and heat. Yeah. Now, I would suggest he might even be talking about electricity or something like that he hasn't yet identified as a nature. But still, I think it's important to lock the door against the idea that he's talking about anything supernatural or that is not matter and void.
It's not an instance of like hermetic forbidden knowledge or other fanciful things.
Mm-hmm.
No, I do kind of wonder why he didn't come up with a name for it. That seems a little odd, but maybe he's thinking about it.
I bet that's
working on it.
important. It's important that he didn't. He's acknowledging that this is something that's not yet discovered, but on the other hand, it's not supernatural. Lucretius people tend to just go through the book and look for particular things that they're interested in, and they'll find this thing, and they'll say there's a fourth unnamed element, and then they'll imply that there's something just non-natural about it.
Now, but there's something else here. We talked about it a little bit before about was there a difference between mind and soul? And these first couple of paragraphs make it sound like he's using mind and soul interchangeably. He doesn't talk about the parts of the mind as being different from the parts of the soul, and this fourth part is like the soul of the soul, but you just said that was the mind. So I think he's saying they're the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Or certainly related in nature, related in the sense of being bodily and being composed of matter and void.
Yeah.
They're not supposed to be different.
How would you say that he says that they're separate things? Because when he says this is in the second paragraph, this fourth something is deeply fixed in the innermost recess of the body, he has just said that's a part of the mind.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then he talks about that being the soul of the soul, and then the united force and power of the mind and the soul. So maybe he's saying the soul is part of the mind. I
mean, you could use them interchangeably, like the mind, being reason, intuition, and the soul as consciousness.
But he seems to be using two different words or two different designations, and it doesn't make sense that they would be identical to each other for him to be using the two words like that.
But he's not saying that the soul is made out of something different from mind.
No,
right?
It wouldn't be some mysterious fourth nature that's like independent or acts differently compared to the other, or made of a different composition than the other natures and particles.
Cassius, do you see what I'm saying? It's not like he's saying mind has four parts, and then he starts talking about the fourth part, the soul of the soul. Mm-hmm. And he hasn't talked about what the soul is made out of other than calling that fourth part the soul of the soul. So it's not real clear that he's saying there's any difference between them.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with the way you stated that at all. It's confusing to me, unclear to me what he's saying there. I would take the position that mind and soul are clearly related in a way, and they clearly cannot, it doesn't appear that they exist without each other or without the body. But what points I can draw from it beyond those, I'm going to follow the Elemen rule and not speculate on what other points I can draw from it, because I'm not sure what else to draw other than what he says explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, if this fourth part is that he's already said his body is the soul of the soul, he could be saying that the soul and the body share the fourth part.
And he does outright state in the next paragraph that the Latin language can't really put it into words,
and maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, let's move into that second passage, because go ahead, Charles.
Last thing in the first paragraph, which was interesting, which was that pain or violent evil penetrates the body and parts of the soul fly away through the pores. But I do think it's interesting, or at least important, that he made the distinction that it stops before fully exiting the body, because otherwise that excess of pain would result in death, or the cease of activity of the soul. So I was wondering maybe if that fourth nature was something a bit about like that, like vital force we were discussing a few weeks ago.
Yeah. I guess he's wrestling with the issue that you can have lumps of elements in front of you on the table, and maybe you could identify all the elements in the body and put them in front of you on the table, but you can't just mix them together and expect them to come to life without some kind of something else added to the picture. But that, on the other hand, that picture can't be supernatural either.
Right. That's a sort of way of stating the hard problem of consciousness, Cassius.
What do you think, Martin?
Yes, Martin, you've been silent.
Yeah, I have difficulty to sort this through because it's again like what was mentioned already. So it's using the wrong model and then tries to infer from that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this could also, like, the thing about, limbs being severed and how that doesn't break off the entirety of the soul, or that the soul doesn't leak out from bone marrow or your bones. He could be referencing some contemporary theories, kind of like how Elaine talked about the humors.
Yeah. It is really kind of fascinating to me from a medical perspective how all sorts of different groups of humans came up with kind of similar ideas and ideas about how the appearance of something would tell you about like the character or the personality of the organism, almost like phrenology. I guess that's more in that third paragraph. It makes me think of guessing at
that third paragraph that you're talking about when you say the word guessing. I mean, that's very significant material in there about, well, actually, I'm sorry. 1, 2, 3. Let me get to the third paragraph. That's the one where he's talking about the deers and the lions and the oxes and so forth. Probably one of the most memorable and significant aspects of what we have as that third paragraph is the conclusion about how the traces of the original nature, which cannot be corrected by the rules of reason, are so small that nothing hinders us from leading a life worthy of the gods. So
yeah.
there's some really important stuff in here that would relate to determinism or DNA and intuition and instinct, and to the whole issue of blank slate for Aristotle, or the issue of preexistence of the soul for Plato.
Yeah.
You've got a tremendous amount of stuff in here to think about.
Yeah, but 2 sentences earlier, he says that the seeds of vice can't be rooted out entirely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That last sentence is clearly not compatible with modern biology. So the whole blank slate we know is wrong, and our DNA, so it's nature versus nurture. I like and I can't remember who said it, but that nature and nurture being the short side and the long side of the you don't say which side actually makes it a rectangle. You've got both, but our genetic features are extremely important, and that they affect our personality, our character, and so on, what we like, what we don't like. You can't just say that there's only a little of that can't be corrected with reason. That's extreme.
Let's be clear about what we're talking about, because when you first made the statement about that last sentence is clearly incorrect, there's many aspects of it, and I was focusing on the part about life worthy of the gods and trying to make a very precise point about whether an Epicurean god is possible or not under this sentence. But Elaine, you're talking about more everyday mental issues, emotional issues, things that you can't simply use reason to talk yourself out of all sorts of
schizophrenia.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course that's like 1 in 100 people, but there are all sorts of other traits that don't rise to the level of a disease that are biological. There's a cluster of, we call them phenotypes, what the actual expression of your genotype and your epigenetic features, that where people with allergies have a stronger startle reflex and can be more prone to anxiety. So it's not, this is just not true. I just think back then there was no way we could have known how much our starting material, epigenetic, and early experiences would affect us later, and that you can't just turn all that around with behaviorism. The behaviorists would have loved this statement.
Yeah, Charles just pointed this out earlier, but let's stay with this point for a while, because I think the practical implications of this, because he said just a few sentences before that the discipline of philosophy may polish and correct some, but it leaves behind the marks of the original nature of the mind, nor are we to think that the seeds of vice can wholly be rooted out. He is clearly acknowledging that seeds of vice, these intuitive or things that these dispositions that animals are born with, they cannot totally be rooted out. And yet a couple of sentences later, he makes the statement that nothing hinders us from leading a life worthy of the gods. So how I do think we ought to spend some time talking about, it's not just a matter of his science is not as good as ours. He's thinking of this contradiction himself. So he had to have had a position himself on why is he saying that the traces of the nature are so small that nothing hinders us from leading a life worthy of the gods, when he has at the same time said they cannot wholly be rooted out. Does that not tell us something about?
They cannot be rooted out.
And he has said that. He has said that in his own text.
No, but I mean, he's making it a smaller contribution.
But he's not providing the context behind it, because the sense about that the original nature that is so small that it doesn't hinder. He opens with saying that on that specific occasion, but just prior to that, he said, where he lists off, the three men, one runs more into passion, the other is much more fearful, and the other one merciful than just. But then he, again, kind of like the second paragraph, he doesn't define it. He doesn't provide substance to what he's saying in the same breath of like an example or a definitive concept or term. He says, or Daniel Brown's translation says, "It is impossible, but the various tempers of mankind and actions that follow them must differ in many other instances, the reasons of which are at present out of my power to explain, nor can I find words to express that variety of figures by which the seeds are distinguished, and from them which this variety of disposition is produced."
Yeah.
And so,
I mean, that's reasonable. He gives a really insignificant place to nature here that it's not warranted. So no, not everybody is going to be able to have a fantastically pleasurable life. There's no
doubt. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. We need to stay with this for a while, because I'm trying to parse out where, Elaine, I think you're probably focusing on that last sentence where he says nothing hinders us from leading a life. If we took out that last sentence, we got line after line after line where he's beating into us that these things cannot be totally eradicated. Mm-hmm. So my view of it would be that to read that last line in a way that is consistent with the rest of it. And that means that, one of the things that I get into a lot back and forth on some of the forums is I don't think a life worthy of the gods means that you have actually achieved immortality, or that you've actually achieved a totally painless life.
No. But even to say more pleasure than pain, Cassius,
not everybody's going to make it. You're right.
Yeah,
not everybody's
and it's just not so very small. It's not just traces. I mean.
I know the source is a bit dubious, but that is something that's brought up in the wise man sayings and Diogenes Laertius, that not everybody would have the same constitution.
Exactly, Bart. That's a great recollection there. You must have really spent a lot of time with that on your past life, Charles, because that's a great thing to remember in this particular context, because he said that not every man can become wise. So we know that they knew that not everybody is going to succeed in all of this.
Yeah. I would have been okay if he had said it, your original nature is material, and it's not only that you can't wholly replace it, that it forms what you are, and yet there are some ways in which you can learn to work with what you have and choose pleasure over pain.
Isn't he implying that it's material?
Yes, yeah. I was restating that. I mean, I think he has said that, but I would have flipped the importance of those things. I would have put a lot more importance on the original nature. And it's not that we're getting rid of the traces of our nature. We're finding out about, what nature, how can we work with what we have to, do the best we can with. Yeah. It's not. You're just not going to remake yourself completely. I mean, neuroplasticity, there is. I don't mean to be saying there's not neuroplasticity. There is, but it's not like we're mostly remaking ourselves and only leaving a little trace, which is the way he's putting it.
I mean, the entire third paragraph is just hammering down that we have this instance of nature that is inherent and intrinsic to us.
Yeah.
And how it differs between person to person.
Yeah.
But there's just something lost in translation between.
I was going to say,
sentences.
yes, I was going to say we can look at the other translations on those last two sentences. But listen, I'm sure that somebody listening to this podcast is also going to say to themselves, why aren't these guys talking about determinism and free will in this context? Because he's going to come down in the end and say that free will is there and that everything is not preordained through determinism. So in talking about these dispositions that these animals have, he is beginning to raise that issue of maybe these dispositions are so strong that there is total determinism and you have no control over the way you act. So in the end, he's got to come back to his previous fundamental position, which is that the swerve exists and we do have some degree of control. So even though we haven't been talking in terms of determinism versus free will, I think that's going on here in the context of this paragraph.
That is a whole big subject that we will probably need an hour to go on. But I think it is important that somebody listening, I mean, we don't have anything to support the concept of a free will that is of the religious sense that it is some kind of part of us that has become autonomously acting that is not connected from the interactions of matter in our body and that can turn around and control us. So what makes determinism not true is a hard determinism is that is probabilities. It's not that we have some kind of autonomous self that isn't related to prior interactions of matter. We can't say anything like that.
And he already admits that there is some variation or capability of change.
Yeah.
In individual behavior.
Right. That's implicit in the way he's talking about
philosophy.
He's talking about the lion is unable to control the torrent of rage that swells within him. That implies that the lion is trying to control the torrent of rage.
Right.
So he's actually resisting that. So it's implicit in his discussion that, yes, you do have some ability to control, but maybe not a complete ability to control. But to me, one of the things that I come back to is that he understands how you've got both these deterministic factors and this ability to have some degree of free will. So to me, when he says that you are still capable of leading a life worthy of the gods, to me, I think we have to look and say that what does it mean to be a life worthy of the gods? There is no such thing as a God who is perfect. And so perfection is not what we're talking about here. Epicurus was not perfect, and yet they compared him to living a life worthy of the gods. So that's part of what's going on here too. Go ahead, Charles. I'm sorry.
Yeah, going back to the free will thing and the lion, the lion being unable to control it. It is interesting that the ox was placed in the middle of them, and how directly after that he says that the principles which form the human mind are much like that, where it's in between, where the ox, doesn't let the anger or rage drive him to, I guess, fury or stampeding, whatever, or is not stunned or scared away easily like the deer. And then afterwards, he follows that up with conceding, or not conceding, but stating that we are capable of change through things like philosophy. So he could have gone further down the free will line, but I don't think that's really the matter or the issue at heart here.
Well, to me, I'm going to go back to the same point again. To me, this is one of those lines that you've got to decide what you really think it means in order to really decide whether you think Epicurean philosophy is worth pursuing or not. Because if you read that line in an extreme way, that nothing hinders reason from preventing us from living a godlike life, if you take that to an extreme, reason does not allow us to live like Jesus Christ or Jehovah. There's no doubt about that. So if you look at it in a conventional type of religious perspective, it makes no sense and you'd have to reject it. But I think there are reasonable ways in which to look at it that do make sense.
Well, if you're reading from a religious perspective, I think you can discount a lot of this book.
That's exactly right, Charles.
Yeah,
Exactly
yeah,
right.
and I really hate. I mean, the free will. I hate that word because there's really no way for people to hear that without going there to this sort of disassociated thing that has escaped material processes. Agency is a much better word. That
Yes.
we have
Yeah.
the experience of agency, this awareness of deciding, but what has led us to make our decisions and to want things, none of that has escaped the I mean, this is all carried about through interactions of particles with probabilistic outcomes, not exactly predict, but it's still matter, even though it's agency. We obviously act on our bodies to change our bodies. I can go out and put another hole in my ear if I want more than one for my earrings. I'm obviously changing my body. I can do things to change my mind, but that with which I change my body is not immaterial, and it has not escaped the causal chain. There's no such thing.
But it was preordained that you'd have another earring.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's only if you don't accept the science that talks about probabilistic events.
Yeah. I mean, earlier when you were talking about free will, saying how agency is a better word, were you talking about like theological free will and like Christianity, or like libertarian free will?
I think that pretty much everybody who argues against free will is talking about theological free will, and it would be real easy to look at what's here and think that there's some part of that is not bound by the causal chain. It's just not true. You can't make any science case for that. I mean, there's no serious scientist who is saying something like that I know of.
Part of the reason for that being that the term worthy of gods is in here.
You have to know what type of gods he's referring to.
And Elaine's point is, too, that just if you're just weighing the percentages of significance, it's going to vary tremendously from person to person how much that person is going to be successful in just becoming a highly rational being versus another one. Not everybody seems to have the same constitution, in using the words from Diogenes Laertius, to become a super rational person, it seems like.
Super rational. So that's not my goal. My goal is to have pleasure, not to become a super rational person.
Right. I agree. I didn't mean to imply that should be. I'm just talking about that in the general context of people thinking that that's a good idea to be. Well, we can probably begin to finish the whole thing that we read today by talking briefly about the fourth paragraph. There's a lot in there as well. And Monroe, in his summary, has hinted that Lucretius is going back and making another analogy here to something he discussed, I think it was back as far back as book 1, into the issue of properties, eternal properties versus qualities, or there seems to be several different words they'll use. They'll use qualities, accidents, and then events. Brown prefers, I think, the word event, but a lot of people will use the word accident here. And so this last paragraph seems to be a discussion of how the soul cannot be separated from the body, and so to some extent that makes it a property, which if you try to separate it out, it's gone. Just like you can't separate water from being wet. It was the analogy I think Lucretius used earlier on. But on the other hand, the mind and the spirit do an awful lot of things which can be separated from the mind and spirit. And those things that they're doing, I guess I'm getting way too ambiguous and broad, but these events and accidents that we experience as our day-to-day life, they're not an eternal part of the soul, I guess. Okay, Elaine saved me from total ambiguity.
Yeah, I don't know. You've sort of lost me. I'm not sure where you're going. What I got from this last bit was, in these times today, people talk a lot more about disembodied consciousness or the soul. We've got those religious ideas about, is there something of us that can exist without the body? But this is interestingly focusing on the reverse, about the body not being able to exist without the soul or the mind or whatever. And so, of course, naturally, I'm thinking about brain death and bodies that are kept going for a period of time with machines, even after the brain has no more activity in it. But it doesn't work very well. The body doesn't really manage itself very well without
atrophy
and yeah. So this is the other side of it that people don't talk a lot about, but I think it's interesting that he brought it up. It's definitely worth noticing that when you died, your body doesn't have any way to maintain itself. And so there's a time separation when the body starts to come apart. It's not like instantly that we vaporize, but the body does rot and come apart without the mind, without the nervous system.
Let me read briefly Monroe's notes on this last part here. He says, the soul is held together by the body and in turn keeps the body in life. The one cannot be torn from the other without destruction to both, any more than perfume can be separated from frankincense. By their mutual motions, sense is kindled. Nor is the body ever born, nor does it grow without the soul, nor continue when the soul has left it. Even in the mother's womb, they learn in common the motions of life. And then Monroe says, to say that the body has no sense and that the soul spread through it alone is what feels, is to contradict a self-evident truth. But it is said that when the soul departs, the body has no sense. And he says, yes, because sense, like much else, is not an inherent property, but an accident only. So Monroe knows this a whole lot better than I do, but there's a lot going on in that last paragraph about what happens and what's the implications of the fact that the body and the mind are inseparably joined and united together.
Throughout most of Book 3 so far, I've always been getting little reminiscence of the very infamous mind-body problem. I mean, that's always going to be brought up whenever you talk about distinguishing, the mind and the body and the soul and all that. But there's a position on the mind-body problem. I'm a little hesitant to bring it up because it's definitely outside my area of expertise. It's called epiphenomenalism.
Help me get it into the Epicurean Friends forum so people who are listening to the podcast can find it.
I'll link it. But it basically, in essence, or to summarize it, physical events and mental events in the body are linked with each other, and changes in the mind are physical through chemicals. And this goes back to like Descartes. So maybe in the following paragraphs in Book 3, it might be of some use in kind of understanding where Lucretius is coming from with the different vapors and airs and what constitutes the mind.
Yeah, looking at the summary paragraph of epiphenomenalism, it's pretty much what you would expect Lucretius to say, I think, just that subjective mental states arise from physical changes within the body and they don't have an independent existence. Is that the point? There's no independent existence to these mental states. I think that would probably summarize.
That's good. Yeah.
The position
because
we're taking.
That like physical things or events in the body are linked, with like thoughts, consciousness, and even cognition, but those themselves would be physical to for that change.
Right.
We are beginning to come to the end of our allotted time for today, and we have had not nearly enough input from Martin. So
yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I also do not have really anything for conclusion on this.
Martin, let me ask this question because you earlier in the episode you made sort of a parallel about that the model was maybe insufficient that Lucretius was using, and in the past you've talked a lot about the hard body model being insufficient. As we start talking about these mental processes and so forth, do you think there is a model issue there, or what strikes you as the way you would unpack? Are we talking about electrical phenomena within the brain? Is what you think is in other words, is there a way for you to summarize what you think the current model is on this subject?
I mean, of course, we can now look again into analogies where this fourth substance he mentions would then possibly something like electric field or electrons or ions or something like that. So that one would be possible, but he's just pulling it from somewhere. So it just once starting with an inadequate model, then by building on that model, it becomes just more fantastic. So he tries to link it sometimes with something like a bit of evidence, but it doesn't really prove this. It's just that things become so complicated based on the wrong thing, so that it doesn't really matter then.
I may not be able to get all of the background noise out from where you were talking there. It actually sounds like somebody's breathing or something. Maybe that's a appropriate
sounds like a dog.
Or a ghost or something like that. Maybe that's an appropriate background noise for our discussion today.
There's a dog barking in the background. Maybe we hear this one. There's actually a dog barking outside.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, then that makes sense. I just, when I say mind, body, I would like to just qualify that I'm always meaning nervous system, rest of the body. I mean, like the mind and the body. The mind is not different from the body. But I like the framing that the mind is also, because our brains are constantly taking in sensory input from the rest of the environment, that our mind is not a brain in a vat. We're not in a vacuum. So mind includes how our nervous system is processing everything else that's going on. But it's not like an insubstantial, like ether ghost kind of thing. I would never mean anything like that.
I lit some incense and my smoke alarm went off.
Well, let's begin to come to a close for the day then. Who else has closing comments?
I don't have any for this week.
Okay. Elaine, anything you haven't added already?
I would say this is clear from this that he is at least saying that the mind, that there's nothing immaterial that's going on with thinking in the mind.
Nothing immaterial, no independent existence for the mind or the soul apart from the body. Is that correct?
Right.
There's nothing that inhabits the body. There's nothing that comes from the outside into the body. It's part of the body, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we probably have a consensus on that point. If anybody disagrees, this would be a good time to say so. But I think we probably have a consensus on that point. And with that, maybe we should close for today. So unless anybody has anything else, we'll come back in another week or so. Okay. So we'll talk to you then.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.